Hi everyone, and welcome to the CRIJ 4313 Corrections and Theory Review for Senior Seminar. My name is Dr. Klein, and I will be holding this review for you all today. In today's lecture, I'm going to work on refreshing your memory regarding the concepts and information we previously discussed in the corrections class. If you have any questions about the material, please don't hesitate to contact me, as this material will be covered on both the capstone exam and the major field test. Let's go ahead and get started on this review. The correctional population in the United States has been increasing steadily over the last few decades. One of the main reasons for that steady increase is the use of mandatory minimums and determinate sentencing practice, which we will continue to discuss in just a bit. As of 2018, the correctional population exceeds 7 million people. This includes those who are incarcerated in jails and prisons, and those who are in community supervision, such as probation and parole. In essence, that means 1 in 30 adults are under some sort of supervision at either the local, state, or federal level. To put this in a different perspective, this equates to about 3.1% of the United States population. This infographic shows the steady increase in the incarceration rate from 1931 to 2005. As you can see, the red line, the incarceration rate, really begins about halfway through the chart. What that indicates is the passage of the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984, which abolished parole at the federal level, implemented the use of determinate sentencing, and increased mandatory minimum sentencing. This meant that people were going to prison for longer and were staying in for longer as well. This directly contradicts the crime rate, which has been steadily going down since the late 1970s. The crime rate has been on a pretty consistent decline since then, in all areas, including property offenses, violent and nonviolent crimes. So even though the incarceration rate keeps climbing, it is not a reflection of the crime rate in our society today. Something else is happening there, and that is really a reflection of the criminal justice policies that have been put in place in an attempt to be hard on crime. This infographic shows you incarceration on a world stage. As you can see here, the United States leads the world in terms of our incarceration rates. We incarcerate more of our citizens in comparison to Russia, El Salvador, Iran, Brazil, and Colombia, and all of the Western European nations as well. The argument always then becomes, well, look at the countries that we're being compared to. Many of these countries simply execute offenders and do a lot of things off the books. While that might be true, but if we're talking only in terms of illegal forms of incarceration, we are leading the pack. If you really break it down and only compare the United States to countries with similar economies, government structures, and a place on the world stage, i.e. England, Germany, France, Canada, etc., we are incarcerating at a very disproportionate rate. Furthermore, we're the only Western industrialized country that still uses the death penalty today. Our criminal justice system is very different from these other countries that have learned to incorporate more rehabilitative programs into the core of their justice systems. The last item I would like to discuss is found on this infographic and has been provided by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, or the BJS. The BJS has nicely broken down the likelihood of incarceration for both genders, and then for white, Black, and Hispanic individuals. Overall, you can see that men have a higher likelihood of incarceration compared to women. 1 in 9 men will be incarcerated compared to 1 in 56 women. When you take race into account, white women are the least likely to be incarcerated, with only 1 in 111 women facing incarceration in their lifetime. Black men, on the other hand, have a very high chance for incarceration. 1 in 3 Black men will be incarcerated in their lifetime. Hispanic men and women are right in the middle of all the racial groups. They're the second most likely racial or ethnic group to be incarcerated in their lifetime, second only to Black men and women. Now let's talk a little bit about where these individuals will be spending their time while they are incarcerated. Jail is used for short-term sentences. These are normally operated by the local authorities and house misdemeanor offenders. This means that they are there for an incarceration sentence of less than 1 year. Jails are also used for pretrial supervision and detaining offenders before they are transferred over to their final prisons. Prisons are for long-term offenders, which means that the offender has been convicted of a felony offense that has an incarceration sentence of 1 year and a day or longer. Prisons are run by the state or by the federal government. Those convicted of federal offenses are incarcerated in prisons run by the Federal Bureau of Prisons, or the FBOP. There is some debate as to whether or not the conditions of the facilities are better in jails or in prisons. Many inmates state that they would rather prefer to be in a prison rather than a jail, as it is more permanent and steadier in treatment. Although neither facility is an ideal place to be, there are some benefits to each location, as we previously discussed in the corrections class. After completing their incarceration sentence, most inmates begin their probation sentences, if they are sentenced to one, or they finish the remainder of their incarceration sentence while on parole. Remember that probation and parole are two different things. Probation is a separate, distinct sentence, whereas parole is the continuation of a prison sentence where an inmate can serve the remainder of that prison sentence while living in the community. If I am sentenced to probation, that sentence can be imposed in one of two ways. First, I can receive a straight sentence. This means that I am only sentenced to probation and will not be incarcerated first. Instead, this is an indicator that my crime wasn't that serious, or that my status as a first-time offender may have helped me in the sentencing process. If I am not getting a straight sentence, then the other option is that I am receiving a consecutive or a split sentence. This means that I will first complete my prison sentence, normally without the option of parole. Once I am released from my incarceration sentence, then I will begin my probation sentence. The state is concerned about my ability to be in the community without supervision post-incarceration, and still wants to keep tabs on me without parole being an option anymore. Because remember, the federal government and the majority of states no longer have parole for all offender groups. Some individuals are sentenced to probation after their incarceration sentences as a way to keep track of them once they are released from prison. But in order to do this, the court must sentence the offender to both an incarceration and a probation sentence at the time of their sentencing. They must be delivered simultaneously. Parole is a little different. So traditionally, the way the parole works is that an individual must be found guilty or plead guilty at the trial court level first. The judge then sentences the defendant to an indeterminate sentence involving a range of prison time, meaning that the defendant receives somewhere between 5 to 10 years, for example, for committing a certain type of felony offense. After 5 years, the inmate reaches the first instance in which he or she can be eligible for parole based on the time that has already been served. Primarily, parole is only a state-level option anymore. The federal government has eliminated parole, but if you were sentenced early enough, then it may be an option for you, but it is few and far between for federal inmates. So what things are taken into account when making a parole release decision? Things like family background, race, ethnicity, nationality, the nature of the criminal offense, the number of criminal accomplices you may have, the nature and the length of your prison sentence, length of time served before parole, whether the defendant accepted a plea bargain, trial recommendations for leniency on the defendant, prior criminal record, and the infraction record while in prison. Based on all of these factors, the inmate may be released from prison on parole at that time. This is called discretionary parole release. The parole board is not required to release the inmate at this time. If the inmate is released, then there are a number of things that he or she must do while on parole in order to remain in good standing. Mandatory parole requires release no matter what after X number of years, depending on the statutory requirements. So even if discretionary parole is not granted, then mandatory parole requirements will release the inmate after so many years. So again, if the sentence is a 5 to 10 year prison sentence and the inmate is released after 5 years, then he or she is required to serve the remaining 5 years of that incarceration sentence on parole. If the parolee does not comply with his or her parole conditions, then most likely they will be sent back to prison to serve out the remainder of that 5-year sentence. Parole officers have some leeway and discretion, much like probation officers, but it is likely that this will happen. If the parole officer tells the court that the parolee has violated the parole conditions, and the court sends the parolee back to prison, this is considered parole revocation. Back to prison you will go, and you will serve out the remainder of your sentence there. In the past, we used to use indeterminate sentencing structures. Indeterminate sentencing meant that after I was sentenced, I got 5 to 10 years, and after the first 5, I might be eligible for parole, for instance, as we just discussed. However, we know that this is not the case anymore. There were too many perceived issues with indeterminate sentencing. There were some parolees who were committing a few high-level, high-profile offenses, and they went to lock that system down. So the country turned towards determinate sentencing in the early 1980s. The federal government abolished parole with the implementation of the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984 and turned toward a determinate sentencing structure, and with it increased the amount of people who are currently incarcerated. Anyone who was sentenced federally after October 1st, 1984 will not be eligible for parole. Most states followed suit, even though there are some states that still use parole. Texas is one of them. Before, there used to be a lot more judicial discretion. Now we have the use of the sentencing guidelines. Under this new style, there are set factors that will influence a person's sentence, but for the most part, there should be strong consistency across the board. With determinate sentencing structures, or if you're in a state that uses truth in sentencing, inmates will serve the majority of their sentences. They will serve a minimum of 85% of their sentences and can be released with 15% of their sentences coming from good time credits. However, if the inmate receives any sort of infraction while incarcerated, those good time credits can be taken away as punishment, and the inmate can serve 100% of his or her sentence. With the change to the sentencing structure, new inmates are being sentenced to longer sentences than ever before, and they're staying in for much longer as well. This means that overcrowding has become a big-time issue for many states, and it's happening very fast. Now I want to spend a little bit of time reviewing the different punishment philosophies that this country has used over the years. Many laws and punishments are set up at least on one of these 5 main punishment philosophies. Retribution has always been popular, trying to extract a payment of a debt to society for the expiation of one's criminal offense. Retribution is based on the belief that crime arouses the anger of the entire community, and the only way to reduce that anger is to punish and almost destroy the offender. We know that retribution doesn't work and only makes the offender angrier and more likely to recidivate. Incapacitation has also been popular as it leaves the offender unable to act while incarcerated and successfully prevents an offender from victimizing members of society. But it does not stop inmates from offending against one another, and it only works while the offender is incarcerated. But the biggest two that we flip back and forth between are deterrence and rehabilitation. Deterrence theory suggests that offenders are discouraged from committing crime because of fear of its consequences, meaning punishment. There are 2 types of deterrence: specific and general deterrence. This suggests that we are personally deterred when we see others being affected by punishment or when we are personally affected by punishment. The death penalty is built around the deterrence principle, but we know that these types of punishments are not effective and, if anything, causes increases in crime. The other philosophy rests in the idea of rehabilitation. Rehabilitation comes in all shapes and sizes. There, of course, is the necessary items for things like substance abuse and anger management, but there are also programs that help inmates contribute back to society. The educational programs that used to exist, meaning that inmates could get anything from a GED or sometimes even a doctorate from prison. However, these days are long behind us since there's limited money, almost no money really, to help inmates get their education while incarcerated. Although rehabilitative programs cost more and many people are reluctant to implement them, Research does show that inmates have lower rates of recidivism when they go through rehabilitative programs while in prison rather than just sitting there for the remainder of their sentence. The formation of the prison system in the United States was entirely based on rehabilitation at one point, but the prison founders called it penance. Taking the root of penance, meaning to be punished for having done something wrong, the prison founders set up a system that was centered around rehabilitation through religious reflection and mediation. The first of our two systems is the Pennsylvania system. This was a system marked by isolation and labor. The inmates were not supposed to talk to one another or be able to identify one another. This was accomplished by wearing a hood that the inmates would wear when they were not in their cells. Their prison cells were very bare bones, and there were almost no amenities at all. Though it was thought that if you left prisoners in isolation long enough, they would have plenty of time to repent and think about what they did wrong. However, as we know, solitary isolation comes with a variety of concerns for the mental health of the inmate. Eastern State Penitentiary is no longer in operation, but it remains one of the best examples of the Pennsylvania system that we have to date. In contrast, the Auburn system was the competing prison system and made efforts to evolve from the solitary confinement that was used in the Pennsylvania system. Instead, the Auburn system took additional steps to just strip away the inmate's individuality. For instance, we see the real first use of uniforms. Inmates were not allowed the freedom to eat where they wanted or even to talk during mealtimes. Additionally, there were strict measures to make sure that the inmates marched in silence and in compliance with prison operations. This technique was called lockstep. Although both prison systems were somewhat progressive for their time, they are not without their individual criticisms. The Pennsylvania system's use of solitary confinement was expensive to build and operate. The prison very quickly became overwhelmed with inmates. There weren't enough cells for the amount of inmates that they were trying to house. In addition, prison officials quickly learned something that we widely acknowledge today, that solitary confinement leads to mental health issues for the inmates. The Auburn system was criticized for many of the things that we do in prisons today, causing the inmates to lose their sense of self. The inmates were required to wear uniforms, remain silent for a large part of the day, and would be required to perform different sets of laborious tasks. They were required to make nails, barrels, clothing, shoes and boots, carpets, buttons, carpenter's tools, steam engines, boilers, etc. They were brutally disciplined, meaning that they were whipped, lashed, or flogged, even for very minor infractions, and then they would receive very limited, if any, medical attention, so many of these inmates would die from infection. They also were subjected to shower baths, which occurred when the prisoner was stripped naked, bound at the hands and the feet, and a wooden collar was placed around the neck to prevent the inmate from being able to turn his head. Then ice water would be poured over the inmate nonstop. This drawing is a drawing of the original Pennsylvania prison, Eastern State Prison, and the prison was located in the middle of Philadelphia and had a big brick wall to keep the inmates inside the prison. The wall went around the perimeter of the prison, and you can see from this picture, the interior structure of the prison itself. It is a spoken wheel look with a center to the prison. You can see that there are 7 cell blocks full of individual cells. The original prison was only comprised of 5 cell blocks, but they later had to expand due to overcrowding issues. Each of these small cells shows an individual cell, meaning that each prisoner got their own space. There was no double or triple cells like we see in modern prisons today. If you think back to the corrections class, you might remember how sparse these cells were. They had just a small cot-like bed, a small bathroom area, and that was about it. The purpose of the cell was for the inmate to live in solitary confinement and to be able to be penitent regarding their crimes. In essence, they're not too different from a prison cell today, but modern prisoners are allowed to keep personal items with them in their cells. This picture is a picture of prisoners walking lockstep at Colorado State Penitentiary, and the picture is dated somewhere between 1898 and 1900. This picture shows 2 things. First, the prisoners are wearing the striped uniforms that we talked about before. Everyone is wearing the exact same thing from their hats down to their shoes. They're also walking in lockstep formation, which would require the inmate to hold one arm against his chest and place the other arm on the shoulder of the inmate that is in front of him. This formation allowed for one correctional officer to monitor 10 to 20 men at a time without any of the inmates getting out of line. To begin with, we have to discuss what bail and bond actually are. These two words are interchangeable, but they are not the same thing at all. To say that someone was released on bail is incorrect. Bail is the type of agreement reached, but not the actual form of release. Because bail is based on statutory categories, there then is normally a set amount for the specific crimes in question, but the type of bail agreement can be reached based on mitigating and aggravating circumstances. Bail basically means that in exchange for something, a signature, money, maybe collateral, I promise to show up for my court hearings. If I don't show up, then I forfeit whatever I promised to the court. Bonds, on the other hand, is the actual payment for that bail. So this is the method that I am released in. You can be released on your own recognizance, which doesn't require cash or collateral. That's the best case scenario, but it's not all that frequent in occurrence. Someone could bond you out. I might not have to put anything down, but if I run, then you're responsible for the bond amount that you put up with if I ran. You could also put up cash or collateral in a secured bond as well. If you cannot afford the bond amount, then you may be required to utilize the services of a bondsperson. In that instance, you would make an agreement with the bondsperson instead of with the court. The bondsman is responsible for the money if I run, which is why they normally use a bounty hunter to find you if you do run. In order for a defendant to be released on bond, they need to meet certain criteria or they won't be released. That criteria starts to be examined once the first bond interviews begin. These typically take place before the defendant's first appearance in court. During those interviews, the officer is looking at the risk factors of the defendant, and they are included in their recommendations of the officers to the judge. These recommendations are handed to the judges, and these individuals are the ones who make the final determination of release. There are three main factors that pretrial officers look at when making a bond determination. The first, the danger risk, looks to see if you are charged with a violent crime, have had a history of violent crimes in the past, committed a dangerous or serious offense, and if these things are present, then pretrial release isn't really looking all that good for you. If you are a danger to yourself or to others, then it is unlikely that you will be released. Second is the recidivism risk factor. This looks at your criminal history to see if you have been active in the past. After all, as we know, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. If you have been rearrested for a crime and when you were currently serving a sentence for another offense, you're probably not going to be released. The more extensive your criminal history, the less likely it is that you will be released on bond. Or, if you're lucky to be released, your bond amount might be through the roof and you won't be able to afford the release. Finally, we have the flight risk factor. If you are a transient person or maybe you're a loner, then you're deemed to be a flight risk. This risk focuses on the likelihood that you will actually show up for court. If it is not very likely that you will show up, then you won't be released. The biggest consideration here is whether or not you have significant ties to the community. If you live and work in the area that you committed the crime in, then you're less likely to flee. Does your family live here? Have you been living in the area long? These are factors that the court will look at. But they will also look to see if you have absconded before or if there are any convictions or active warrants for failure to appear in court. If there are, then you probably won't be released on bond. Pretrial supervision is maintained by pretrial service officers. We just discussed topics related to bond release, but there are bond releases present in federal, state, and local pretrial offices. The bigger pretrial units are located in bigger areas, and some pretrial services agencies are combined offices with probation. But your officers are either serving a pretrial or probation function only. Post-arrest, pretrial officers are the first ones to make interactions with the defendant that they will have within the court system. Defendants are now under the supervision of the court system, even though they are being held in custody at the local jail until they are formally released on bond. Pretrial officers encounter a lot of the same issues with defendants that the arresting officers and jail officials do. There are issues with mental illness. Pretrial officers are often trained to look for mental illness issues, and they ask the defendant about any sort of medication that he or she might be taking at the time. If they suspect that this is a mental illness defendant, they can make recommendations for further psych evaluation or can recommend diverting the defendant elsewhere if appropriate. If the court determines that you are a suitable candidate for bond, the pretrial supervision process begins. Most defendants have a set of conditions that they must abide by in order to remain in good standing with the court. This could involve things like no drug use, no alcohol, complying with drug testing, maintaining stable residence, a possible curfew, no interaction with co-defendants or with alleged victims, possible no internet access, but that is typically something that is more commonly applied to sex offender defendants. If you break the conditions of your bond release, then you go back to jail until your next court appearance. The last item that I want to discuss today is the continued use of the death penalty. Parts of the country are still using the death penalty. It is not mandatory for states to use the death penalty, and in fact, quite a few states choose not to use the death penalty at all. However, of those who still do use the death penalty, more than 60% of executions come from 5 states: California, Florida, Texas, Pennsylvania, and Alabama. Texas is the big daddy of them all, and we'll talk about the state a little bit more in just a second. Even though California does have a good-sized death row, they're not all that eager to execute. They only have executed 13 individuals since the reinstitution of the death penalty, and the last one was in 2006. California's death row currently has more than 850 individuals sitting on it. At the time of this recording, there were about 2,700 inmates on death row. That figure is down about 200 inmates since 2016. The majority of that decrease is due to execution rather than through commutation or release. Hands down, Texas routinely executes the largest amount of inmates every year and has the largest execution count since the reinstatement of the death penalty post-CRIJ. Since 1973, 156 individuals have been exonerated due to issues regarding actual innocence and procedural errors. This statistic indicates that since the reinstitution of the death penalty in 1976, one person has been set free from death row for every 10 individuals who have been executed. That's a pretty staggering statistic, if you ask me. Currently, 31 states, the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and the United States military all use the death penalty, but it has been a long while since the FBOP actually executed anyone. The most common form of execution is through lethal injection, but there have been several issues concerning botched executions and the availability of the drug cocktail over the last few years that have caused delays in the execution process in several states. The constitutionality of the death penalty has been brought into question over the years, but the biggest case regarding its constitutionality occurred in 1972. The case of Furman v. Georgia in 1972 was really a joint case brought up by several inmates located in Georgia, Texas, and several other states. In this case, the inmates argued that the use of the death penalty was just all over the place. Courts were sentencing defendants to the death penalty for anything and everything. The victims died in some of the cases, but often survived in many others. There was no uniform application of the punishment. The Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty violated the Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment, and the federal government put a de facto moratorium on the capital punishment. The death penalty was not being used just in homicide cases, but instead it was being applied to rapists, to juveniles, the mentally ill, and a large proportion of African Americans were being executed compared to whites, despite similar numbers of crimes being committed by both racial groups. The court ruled that there was arbitrary application occurring, therefore resulting in a de facto moratorium on the death penalty, and inmates were commuted from death row to life in prison. As you can imagine, states that wanted to continue to use the death penalty were upset by this ruling and started scrambling to reform their death penalty regulations so that they could continue the practice. States were still wanting to use the death penalty, but the Supreme Court said until you fix the system, you cannot use it. You need to include some safeguards that protect individuals who are subjected to the death penalty. So during the moratorium that was implemented, states started drafting new laws and protocols that would implement the things that the Supreme Court wanted in the Furman ruling. Then the Supreme Court reviewed those safeguards and said, okay, we're good, you can reinstate the death penalty. 4 years later, SCOTUS ruled in CRIJ v. Georgia in 1976 that states could start using the death penalty again. As you can see from this slide here, states must implement several new steps in order to reinstate the death penalty again. The courts mandated the following must occur. States have to take into account aggravating and mitigating circumstances. They also have to have bifurcated trials. There has to be an automatic appellate review of conviction and of the sentence. And finally, there has to be a proportionality review. Once these things occur, inmates have the right to continue to appeal their case up until the last possible moment. Once those appeals are exhausted, only a last-minute pardon or commutation from the governor can save the inmate. So that's about the gist of what I wanted to review with you guys today. Hopefully you have saved all your materials from the corrections class and are able to continue to study those materials in senior seminar. Although this review is rather detailed, I won't call it comprehensive by any means. There still may be information on the capstone exam or on the major field test that was not covered in this lecture. If you have any questions about this review or anything else corrections related, please get in touch with me before you take the capstone exam or the major field test. Thank you all for your time and your attention today. Have a great day, everyone. Bye.